I watched the tree line through my cabin window for 3 nights straight, and on the 3rd night it was closer. Not the shadows, not the light playing tricks, the actual tree line, the edge of the forest where the grass ends and the pines begin, had moved approximately 15 feet closer to my cabin overnight. I measured it. I had hammered a stake into the ground on day 1 to mark where the trees started. By the morning of day 3, the nearest pine was 15 feet past the stake, standing in grass that hadn't had a tree on it 48 hours earlier. Roots buried in soil that was flat and open when I arrived. I stood in my yard holding a tape measure and staring at a tree that shouldn't have been there, and I felt something I had never felt before. Not fear, disbelief, the kind of disbelief that makes your hands go numb because your brain is rejecting what your eyes are showing it. I'm a wildlife photographer, 37 years old. I spend weeks at a time alone in remote locations. I have a small cabin on leased Forest Service land in northern Idaho that I use as a base camp. No electricity, no running water, a wood stove and a propane lantern, and the kind of silence that most people pay money to experience for a weekend, and I live in for months at a time. I know the woods. I know what's normal. Trees don't move. I know that. You know that. Everyone knows that. But I'm telling you what I measured. I'm telling you what I saw, and I'm telling you what happened on the 4th night when I decided to stay up and watch. Subscribe right now if you haven't. Also hit that like button. 1 second. You need to hear the rest of this. The first 2 nights at the cabin were normal. I arrived on a Monday afternoon in late September. I unloaded my gear. I set up my cameras. I chopped wood. I cooked dinner on the propane stove. At night, I sat on the porch and listened to the forest, elk bugling in the distance, an owl somewhere close, the usual soundtrack. I went to bed early and slept well. The 2nd day, I hiked about 4 miles to a ridge where I had spotted a wolf pack earlier that summer. I spent the day shooting and came back at dusk. Everything was the same. Cabin, clearing, tree line, normal. On the morning of day 3, I walked out to the porch with my coffee, and something felt wrong. I couldn't identify it at first. The clearing looked the same. The sky was gray. A light mist was hanging in the air. Then I realized what it was. The trees were closer. The nearest pine was maybe 20 feet from the cabin. It had been 35 feet when I arrived. I knew that because I had parked my truck between the cabin and the tree line on day 1, and there had been plenty of room. Now the nearest branches were almost touching my truck's antenna. I walked out to look. That's when I saw the stake I had driven into the ground on my first day. I always mark the tree line when I set up at a new location. It's a habit from years of photographing wildlife. The stake helps me gauge if animals are using the same paths. The stake was now 15 feet behind the nearest tree, surrounded by pines that had no business being there. I checked the ground around the new trees. The soil was undisturbed, no upheaval, no fresh dirt, no sign that anything had been dug up or replanted. The roots disappeared into the ground like they had always been there. The pine needles on the branches were healthy, green, full. These weren't dead trees that had fallen into a new position. They were living trees, standing upright, with root systems buried deep. I touched the bark. It was rough and cold and real. I grabbed a branch and pulled it. It flexed and snapped back. It was a tree, a real living pine tree, standing in a spot where 48 hours earlier there had been nothing but grass. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in a chair by the window with the propane lantern off and watched the tree line. The moon was half full, enough light to see the outline of the trees against the sky. I watched for hours. Nothing moved. The trees were still. The forest was quiet. Around 2 a.m., I felt my eyelids getting heavy. I blinked. I blinked again. I might have closed my eyes for 10 seconds, maybe 15. When I opened them, the nearest tree was closer. Not 15 feet closer like before. Maybe 2 feet, but it was closer. I was sure of it. The branch that had been a foot from my truck antenna was now touching the metal. I heard it, a faint scrape, metal on bark. the branch pressing against my truck in total silence. No wind, no movement, just a tree that was 2 feet closer than it had been 15 seconds ago. I left the next morning at first light. I packed everything in under 20 minutes. I didn't take the time to secure my gear properly. I just threw it in the truck. When I backed out of the clearing, I had to navigate between trees that hadn't been there when I pulled in 3 days earlier. The gap between 2 pines was barely wide enough for the truck. I scraped both sides, getting through. I drove 3 hours to the nearest town and checked into a motel. I sat on the bed and tried to write down what had happened while it was fresh. My hands were shaking too hard to hold the pen steady. I went back to the cabin 2 weeks later during the day with a friend. The tree line was back where it had been originally, 35 feet from the cabin. The stake was at the edge of the trees. The pines that had moved were gone, or rather they were back where they belonged. The grass where they had stood was unmarked. No holes, no dead patches, no evidence that a 40-foot pine tree had been standing there 14 days ago. My friend looked at me like I was losing my mind. I showed him the scrape marks on both sides of my truck. He couldn't explain those. Nobody can.
I was filtering water from a creek in the Pisgah National Forest in North Carolina when a woman walked out of the water 30 feet upstream, not out of the woods toward the water, out of the water. She rose up from the creek like she had been lying on the bottom. The water was maybe 18 inches deep. She stood up and the water ran off her clothes and her hair, and she looked directly at me. She didn't gasp, she didn't shiver, she didn't react to being soaking wet in 50-degree air. She just stood in the middle of the creek staring at me with an expression that had nothing behind it, no emotion, no recognition, no life, like a face that had been carved and placed on a body that didn't know what to do with it. I was 25, an experienced backpacker. This was day 2 of a 4-day solo trip on the Art Loeb Trail. I had been filtering water at a creek crossing around 4 p.m. The sun was getting low. The forest was thick, rhododendron and hardwood, and the kind of understory that blocks your view beyond 20 feet in any direction. I hadn't seen another person since the trailhead that morning. The creek was clear and cold, and I was crouched on a rock squeezing my Sawyer filter when I heard the splash. If this story is already making your skin crawl, drop a comment. I want to know how many of you have been alone in the woods and seen something you can't explain. The woman was maybe 40, hard to tell. She was wearing a gray t-shirt and dark pants, no shoes, no pack, no gear of any kind. Her hair was dark and plastered to her face and neck. She was pale, not fair-skinned pale, gray pale. The same gray I described on her face was on her arms and her hands, like she hadn't seen sunlight in a very long time, or like the blood under her skin wasn't doing what blood is supposed to do. She stood in the creek with the water flowing around her shins and she looked at me. I said hello. She didn't respond. I asked her if she was okay. Nothing. I asked her if she needed help. Her mouth opened, not to speak. It just opened, slowly, like a reflex, and then it closed, and then it opened again. Like she was trying to form a word but didn't know how, or like she was mimicking speech she had observed but never performed. I stood up from the rock. I took a step back. The woman tilted her head, not the way a person tilts their head when they're curious, sideways, too far, past the angle a neck should comfortably allow. She held it there, tilted, water dripping off her chin, mouth slightly open, eyes locked on mine. Then she took a step toward me, through the water. The splash was wrong, too quiet. Her foot went into the water, and it barely displaced, like she weighed less than she should, or like the water didn't want to touch her. I grabbed my pack. I didn't put it on. I held it by the top strap, and I turned and walked, not ran, walked. The same instinct I had felt in other dangerous situations in the woods. Don't run. Running triggers pursuit. Walk. Steady, controlled. I walked upstream along the trail, without looking back. For about 2 minutes I heard splashing behind me, slow, matching my pace, the same steady rhythm, step, splash, step, splash. Then it stopped. I kept walking for another 5 minutes before I turned around. The creek was empty. No one was behind me. No one was in the water. I looked at the spot where she had been standing. Nothing, just clear water flowing over smooth rocks. I double-checked. I walked back to within 20 feet of where she had risen. The creek was maybe 18 inches deep. Rocky bottom. Nowhere to hide. Nowhere to go. She had been standing there 7 minutes ago, and now there was nothing, not upstream, not downstream, not on either bank, just water and rocks and the sound of the forest pretending nothing had happened. I hiked out that afternoon. I didn't finish the trip. I walked 8 miles back to the trailhead before dark, and drove home. I told my boyfriend what happened. He believed me. He's known me long enough to know I don't make things up, and I don't scare easily. I searched online for any reports of a missing woman in Pisgah National Forest. Nothing matched. No missing hikers, no drowning victims, no reports of anyone matching her description. I posted about it in a hiking forum without giving the exact location. 3 people responded privately. 2 of them had stories about seeing a woman near water sources in remote parts of the southern Appalachians. One said the woman was standing in a river, the other said she was crouched at the edge of a lake. Both described the same gray skin, the same vacant expression, the same head tilt. Both experiences happened at dusk. Both hikers were alone. Neither one ever found an explanation, and none of us has gone back.
I've been a park ranger in the Pacific Northwest for 18 years. I'm not going to tell you which park. I'm not going to tell you my name. What I'm going to tell you is something that happened on a Tuesday night in October of 2023 that made me request a transfer to a desk position after nearly 2 decades in the field. I didn't get the transfer, budget reasons, so I'm still out there, walking the same trails, sleeping in the same backcountry stations, listening to the same forest, except now I listen differently. Now I listen for the sound, and every night I pray I don't hear it again. The backcountry station I'm assigned to is about 9 miles from the nearest road. It's a small wood frame building with a cot and a desk and a radio. No cell service, no internet. I stay there for 5-day rotations during the busy season. My job is trail maintenance, clearing deadfall, checking bridges, monitoring campsites. I know every tree within a 3-mile radius of that station. I've walked these trails thousands of times. I can navigate them in the dark. I know the sounds, the elk, the owls, the coyotes, the wind through old-growth canopy. I know what every single sound in this forest is, except one. On this particular night, I was lying on my cot around 11 p.m., reading by headlamp. The forest outside was quiet, normal quiet. Not the dead silence that usually precedes something. Just a calm October night. Then I heard it. It started low, a vibration more than a sound, like standing too close to a transformer. A hum, deep and resonant, coming from everywhere, not a direction, everywhere. The walls, the floor, the air, like the forest itself was producing the sound. The hum lasted about 30 seconds, and then it shifted. It went from a steady tone to something modulated, rising and falling, almost musical, but not music, not any pattern I recognized. It felt organic, like a vocalization, like something with lungs the size of a building was humming in the dark. I got up and went to the door. I opened it. The sound was louder outside, much louder. It was coming from the trees, from all of them. Every tree, in every direction, was vibrating. I could see the branches trembling, not from wind. There was no wind. The air was perfectly still. The branches were shaking from the sound. Pine needles were falling like rain. The ground was vibrating under my boots. I could feel it through the soles, through my knees, through my chest. My teeth were buzzing. The fillings in my molars were humming. I stood on the porch of that station and watched the entire forest shake with a sound that had no source and no explanation, and I felt something I had never felt in 18 years of working alone in the wilderness. I felt small, like I was standing inside something enormous that had just woken up. The sound lasted 4 minutes and 11 seconds. I know because I timed it on my watch. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely read the dial. 4 minutes and 11 seconds of the forest humming, vibrating. Then it stopped, not faded. Stopped. One moment the world was trembling, and the next it was silent. Dead silent. The kind of silence that hurts your ears. No insects, no wind, no owls, nothing. Like every living thing in the forest had been listening too, and was now holding its breath. I stood on that porch for another hour. The silence held. Eventually, the insects came back, then the wind, then an owl. The forest rebuilt itself, sound by sound, like a machine rebooting. By morning, everything was normal. The trees were still, the branches were intact, the ground was solid. I radioed my supervisor and told him I had experienced seismic activity. He checked with the Geological Survey. No earthquakes, no tremors, no underground events, nothing registered on any instrument within 200 miles of my station. I've heard it 2 more times since then, once in March of 2024, once in August. Same sound, same duration, roughly 4 minutes each time, same aftermath of total silence followed by a slow rebuild of normal forest sounds. No geological explanation, no meteorological explanation, no biological explanation. I've talked to other rangers, quietly, off the record. 2 of them have heard it. Both in the Pacific Northwest, both in old-growth forest, both alone, both at night. Neither of them reported it officially. One of them told me he thinks the forest is alive, not alive the way trees are alive the way an animal is alive. He thinks the old-growth forests have a consciousness, a collective awareness that occasionally surfaces as sound. I don't know if I believe that, but I know what I felt when the ground was shaking under my boots and the branches were raining pine needles and the fillings in my teeth were humming with a frequency that came from nowhere and everywhere at the same time. I felt like I was trespassing, like I had been tolerated for 18 years, and the forest was reminding me that tolerance is not the same as welcome. I still work out there. I still sleep in that station, but I don't read at night anymore. I lie on the cot in the dark, and I listen because I know it will happen again, and I want to be ready. Not to fight it, not to explain it, just to hear it start, so I can count the seconds and pray it stops at 4 minutes and 11 seconds again. Because I don't know what happens if it goes longer, and I don't think I want to find out. Those were 3 true stories from people who went deep into the forest and discovered that the forest is keeping secrets most of us will never know. If you made it to the end, tell me which one shook you the most. Drop it in the comments. If you've experienced something in the woods that you've never been able to explain, leave your story below. The most disturbing ones get featured in future videos. Subscribe if you haven't. New stories every week. Share this with anyone who spends time in the wilderness. And the next time you're standing in a forest and everything goes quiet, ask yourself this: is the forest empty, or is it listening?